I became really well known relatively quickly. Because my very first book, and I have my very own first copy here, The Embroiderer's Countryside, came about because it was commissioned by Vivian. And all credit really to David and Charles that they allowed me to write a book which was considerably different to any other embroidery book which had ever been brought to the public before that, because it was a book about embroidery, but not just for embroiderers. It encompassed all sorts of different subject matter, obviously focusing to a large extent on the countryside, but a lot of people read that book for the enjoyment of the pictures, for the little stories that went along with it. And throughout my career, I've tried to balance this idea of art and embroidery and people both within the embroidery world and outside of it, bringing them together. Shortly before I met Vivian and that book was published, I'd been working with the British Museum in a capacity of experimental and practical archaeology to do with early embroidery, in particular the Anglo-Saxon period. And really, there were two sort of prototype types of stitches which were used in very early Anglo-Saxon embroidery, the type of Anglo-Saxon embroidery which grew into what we now think of as opus Anglicanum, simply English work. Didn't matter where you were in the world, if you wanted embroidery, you sent to England for it, simply because we did it best here. And those two kind of prototype techniques were split stitch, which a lot of people have heard of, and opus plumarium, literally feather work, which not quite so many people have heard about, and very few people really outside of the embroidery archaeology world had heard about at all until I wrote that first book, when I started using that expression rather more. And if you're wondering why there's a blank space over here, it's so that I can hold things up to you. Now, this is the type of embroidery that I was researching at the time, gold and silk work. And it's a little bit difficult to see, but if I bring it really nice and close there, you can see that the coloured elements, the silk stitching, is worked in split stitch, which is basically simply a straight stitch, after which the needle is brought up through the stitch, stitched again and carried on. So you're splitting every stitch. And the other technique, the opus plumarium, the feather work, was used working longer stitches, but still straightforward, ordinary stitches, nothing fancy. And I've got here, in fact, the original picture that we used for the cover of the Embroiderer's Countryside. And again, if I bring that a little bit closer, you can see the striations, the approximate size of the stitches there. If I move it in the light, you can see how those stitches catch the light beautifully. Now, those two prototype stitches over the centuries, over the generations, morphed into all the more complex stitches that we think of today, all the stitches over the generations which we can think of as being put into all those wonderful samplers from the Tudor period onward. The stitches became more and more elaborate, but not necessarily, certainly to my way of thinking, did they become easier to use when it came to capturing the reality of your subject. The simpler the stitch, the easier to capture the reality of your subject. Now, the lovely Trevor who is Vivian's partner, is our techno wizard with us today. And if I could ask the lovely Trevor, please, for the first slide. He's hitting a button, but nothing's happening. There we go. There we go. The first slide simply is to illustrate a very simple stitch. Now, some of you may in fact already have my ebook, One Simple Stitch. If you do, you'll recognize this as simply being a still from the very, very first little bit of that ebook, just simply demonstrating that basically this simple stitch, just a straight stitch, is the basis of all of my work. Nothing fancy, nothing more complicated in one simple stitch. If you can take a stitch, if you can bring your needle up through the fabric, thank you, Trevor. If you can bring the needle up through the fabric, take a stitch and put it back down again, then you can embroider. If we can just have the next slide very quickly, Trevor. That simple long stitch is what's used to create, as I say, all the basics of my work. And okay, Trevor, we only needed that one just for a moment like that because I've got the real thing with me. If I can bring that up close there, you can see how those long simple stitches catch the light as it travels around, as it changes, and the color, the refraction changes as I move there, particularly obviously on the flower itself, but also look at what's happening down there on the leaves. Look at the way the colors change on that large leaf. There are only two different shades there, one lighter above, one darker below, but you can see as I move that around how easily the long, straight, simple stitch catches the light. And this adds to the three-dimensional effect of our stitching. So Trevor, if we could just quickly have one more. This simply shows you how we are just using that one simple stitch. If you can bring your needle out at the outside of your motif and take it in at the inside of your motif, or in this case, slightly before you get to the end of the row of stitches, because we're sweeping the angle of the stitching around, you can use that simple long stitch to create a simple petal. Thank you, Trevor. Now, the whole idea of using this long, simple stitch is very much to be able to catch the light, catch the refraction of the light as we stitch to enhance the three-dimensional effect. Now, to a large extent, I do work in pure silk. We get that particular sheen of the silk when it comes to getting that three-dimensional effect, because the silk that I use isn't twisted in any way. It's floss silk, it's very fine. I double and treble it up if I need a solid infill effect, or use it singly if I want something more ethereal. But you don't have to be working in a fancy thread such as silk. You can work this type of embroidery in any type of thread which is suitable for, if I can put it this way, flat work embroidery, straightforward embroidery which is going to lie on the surface of your fabric. And while we're talking about fabric, I will just say one or two things without going into too much detail about fabric. I know we have had a query in about fabric, so I'll just say a few things about that. The most important thing with your fabric for this type of embroidery is that it needs to have no stretch. It needs to be an even weave with no stretch. So an even weave cotton, a poly cotton I particularly like, or anything, as I say, which basically has no stretch, because you need to be able to get it into your little tambour hoop like this, get it tight as a little drum. They're not called tambour hoops just for fun. They're like that because they're little tambourines. So a fine, even weave cotton or poly cotton is absolutely ideal. At the end, we'll talk a little bit more about that and where you can get it and what it's called and that sort of thing. But again, as with the thread itself, yes, you can use something exotic like silk, but you can also use something far less exotic, something that we're all familiar with, like good old anchor, DMC, stranded cotton, anything which basically you're comfortable with will still give you that refraction of light if you get your stitches in the right place. Maybe not absolutely as vibrantly as with the floss silk, but you will still get that effect. So don't think that you've got to start spending a lot of money until you're confident, until you know that you want to go on. Just start with a fabric that you're familiar with. And Trevor, the next slide, if we could just quickly have that. The next slide is another floral subject. It's a little clematis flower. And the first of my masterclass series of books, whenever you're ready, Trevor, I'm just rambling over the top. The first of my masterclass series of books was embroidered flowers, because flowers really are the easiest way to begin to get the hang of these type of techniques. Not for nothing, indeed, has embroidered archaeology, or should I say the archaeology of embroidery, shown us that the very first motifs which were created, or the first that we've been able to find and actually identify and look at, were created to replicate flowers, leaves, things from the countryside, things that people were familiar with. And so it's not surprising, I guess, that my first masterclass book, which strayed slightly away from the more, shall we say, obscure subjects and into how to do it, was covering flowers. And my ebook that I created with Vive Books, with Vivian, also takes us through subject matters from the simple, which begins with flowers and leaves and that sort of thing, through into the much more complex. We go into animals to begin with, birds, then animals. First of all, small animals that a lot of us might be familiar with, little mousies, little beasties, and then into far more exotic subjects, giraffes, tigers. Again, those of you who are really familiar with my work will recognize those sorts of subjects. I've shared them widely on Facebook and on my website. From the subject of flowers, which, as I say, the next one was this, both the little rose that we looked at a moment ago and the clematis are the first in my series of downloadable patterns, which are published also by Vive Books. So it's a really good sort of entry level, these two, the little rose and also the clematis. Those are the simplest designs which are available independently of the ebook. And had our slides been working a little bit better today, we were in fact going to show you, oh, there's the third one.
Yes.
The lovely Trevor is stepping up to the mark here.
Yeah.
The third in the same sort of introductory level is this one with the rather beautiful orchid. I keep trying to point at it and think you can see what I'm doing, like I used to when I was showing the old steam projector slides. But in this one, you can see that we've taken the technique of that long, simple stitch a little bit further by working into several strata. We can see that we're now moving into one or more different strata of colour. We're still using nothing more complex than one simple straight stitch here. The whole of this design, with the exception of those few little beads just down on the bottom lip there, is worked in nothing more complex than our simple straight stitch. And indeed, the beads themselves are sewn on with a simple stitch as well. So basically what we have here is a kind of hybrid between those two prototype techniques of the long, simple straight stitch, but this time each of those stitches is being split by its neighbour, so to speak. So we're creating an elongated sort of split stitch. So the orchid is the next one in the series of patterns which you might be interested in. And after that, we come to a slightly more complex design, which is the poppies, if we can have that one, please, Trevor. When I say slightly more complex, it's simply the design which is a little more complex. The stitches themselves are still worked in nothing more complicated than our straight stitch. But the poppies here are a particularly good example of what happens when you use a single colour, in this case red, and change the direction of the stitches so that they catch the light. It's hard to believe that it's all worked in just a single shade, because the colours look so different the way the light's catching them that you would swear that there was an almost infinite number of colours being used in there. But the only thing which is creating that change of colour, that three-dimensional effect, is the direction of the stitches. So once again, it's not the complex nature of the stitch, it's what we're doing with it that gives us that lovely effect. Now, that particular pattern is just that little bit more complex than the first three that we looked at, but it leads on very nicely. And for those of you who perhaps are a little bit more confident, again, that's a really good entry level pattern to go in on. There's nothing more complex there than that which I've just spoken about. And while we're talking about how beautifully the silk reacts to that kind of directional stitching, if we can just quickly have a little look at the silk itself, Trevor. This just shows you several of the copse, and it's simply wound onto those cardboard tubes, but you can see that the way the silk itself is wound changes directions, and so you get an infinite different number of shades of a single colour just by using one type of silk. So although, as I say, it's obviously a little bit more expensive than using a cotton or a less shiny silk, you don't need to actually buy from wherever you're getting your silk. And again, I can talk about that a little bit later if you like. You don't have to spend a great deal of money in getting 101 different shades of green, because say 2 or 3 different colours of green are going to give you this really great range of shades. So after we look at the simpler types of subjects, which we just have, which I've sort of categorized as the floral subjects, we can start to work our way forward into some slightly more complex subjects like birds and butterflies, or indeed the other way around, butterflies and birds. And I've actually got one here with me of, if I bring that nice and close up there, red admiral butterfly, you can see there. And again, as I tip it backward and forward and it catches the light differently, you can see how it changes shade. Now, one thing that we have to think about when we're working this type of embroidery is obviously how to find the correct direction for our stitches, because if you're not imitating life with your art, then obviously it's not going to work quite so successfully. So we need to find what I call the core to each subject. And on our butterfly, the core is the center of the insect here, in the same way as on our flowers, the core was the center of the flower. So we need to look at each of our subject matter and think about where is the core, where are our stitches going to fall toward. The joy, of course, of being able to have a pattern such as we've created with Vive books is that is given to you. You've got the core shown to you. You know the direction of the stitches that you're going to be working in. So you don't need to worry about that quite so much. But it's interesting to learn the principle of that so that when you go on to create your own designs, you kind of know what you're doing. I think we can actually miss out on the next one, Trevor, and go straight on to the mouse. Can you do that for us? Because we have to think when we've got slightly more complex subjects, as I say, as to where our stitches are going to fall. So with something like this, where we've got a combination of the foliate subject and a little beastie like our mouse, we can get our mindset working with things like the berries. The stitches are falling back to the core, to the center of each of those little berries. And that gives us the clue as to where the core for something like a little mousey is, and that is the very tip of his nose. He's looking dead straight at us, just like a little berry which was facing us with the pip, if you like, the central bit facing us. And so all the stitches on little mousey, all of his face stitches, are falling back towards that central core. And on the patterns that I've created for all of these pictures, you're actually given that directional flow, so you don't actually have to work it out for yourself. You then have to think to yourself, okay, I've got his face, I've got the direction of the stitches towards his face, but what's going to happen with the rest of his body? Now, this is where you have to kind of think a little bit outside of the box, and you have to imagine that little beastie and think about what's happening with his fur. Think of the way it's lying on his body. Think, in fact, of the way a bird's feathers lie on its body, the feather work, the opus plumarium. You see where I'm going with this. It's an exact interpretation of what those early Anglo-Saxon artists, embroidery artists, were doing. And so it works so incredibly well for these natural history type subjects. Now, those of you who've got cats and dogs and that sort of thing, you know the way fur lies on an animal's body. You know it goes down or rather it radiates out from the nose. You know the direction of the way it lies. So you need to think about that when you put together your own design of these types of subjects. But as I say, we've done all the hard work for you when it comes to these particular subjects. Can we have the hedgehog next, please, Trevor? If anybody can see anything wobbling about, incidentally, at this end, it's because my cat has just decided that he wants to play with the flecks coming off the computer. So here with the little hedgehog, again, he's facing us. He's looking at us full face. And you can see the flow of the stitches all coming back towards that core at his nose. But of course, not all little animals are little furry beasties. Some, like our little fellow here, have got different types of covering. In his case, he's got his prickles. But the individual prickles, which are worked in a variation of our stitch, which I call chevron stitch, still simply work though with simple straight stitches. Even his little prickles are in fact falling back towards his nose. Thanks very much, Trevor. Okay, so we've looked at what happens when we're looking at a subject matter, a little beastie, for instance, full face. We've looked at what's happening there. We've taken our lead, as it were, from looking at a simple flower, which is open. We've looked at our little animal, which is looking at us full face. But what happens when our subject matter, our little animal, or indeed a bird, turns away from us? What happens when we've got a profile that we have to work with? Well, what happens is, as our subject turns, he takes the core. In the case of a bird, his beak. In the case of a little beastie, his nose. He takes his core with him. So that core is the thing which we have to establish. And if I can bring that little bird really close up to the screen for you, can you see the very tip of the beak there? Now, in this case, that is the point towards which our feather work, our opus plumarium, our working of that one simple straight stitch is flowing to. And the same applies when it comes to little beasties. They might not, in fact, turn to a complete profile. We might see them in a 3/4 profile, such as we are with our little mousie there. We're seeing him in a 3/4 profile, and the same with his companion on the other side. But nevertheless, whichever way he turns, he's taking his core with him. He's moving his core, he's moving his nose, and therefore he's taking the flow of those stitches with him. It takes a little while to sort of get into the mindset of this, but once you've got it, once you've got that set in your mind, it really does work. And I know that from having taught this technique all over the world. In those days, I couldn't sit and talk into a screen. I used to have a big drawing board behind me, and I used to draw it all out for people to see. Now we've got videos. If you watch my ebook, The One Simple Stitch, you'll be able to see this all literally coming together. You can see me stitching it, which is an awful lot better than seeing me do it live, because you can stop me every 5 minutes and get me to do it over again. So if we can go to our next slide, please. Lovely, Trevor. We're all getting good at this now. Here we do have a little beastie presenting himself absolutely in full profile, a little snoozy dormouse. This is another pattern that we've prepared specially for you. His nose, obviously, is just down where his little paw is wrapped around. And so all of the stitches fall towards that core, towards where his little nose is. And here, where he's curled up into such a darling little ball, is a perfect example of how the flow of those stitches can really go the complete 360 degrees all the way around the subject matter and back into that core. Now you can see also on this picture, or you could, it's all right, Trevor, don't go back, that we've also beginning to introduce some different little elements, some different techniques into these designs. Yes, they're different elements. Yes, they're different techniques, but they're still the same one simple stitch. You're still stabbing and pulling. You're not doing anything fancy. There's nothing other than our simple straight stitch. And if we can go on into our next one, please, Trevor, we're back with what I call my signature bird, the Kingfisher. I think I've been asked to stitch kingfishers possibly more than any other natural history subject over the last 40 odd years. Not surprisingly, I guess, because they are such a gift to artists in all media, but in particular to our particular art, because they do have this wonderful color which is so exaggerated and exemplified by this sweep of the stitches, by the feather work. Some of those little techniques that I mentioned that we're adding on here include a rather favorite technique of mine, which I actually invented, if I can put it that way, which I call the Honeycomb Technique, which I've used in the dragonfly's wing here. And in fact, we have a video again up on YouTube that you can watch to see me actually create this. So none of the techniques in any of these particular designs which we're looking at today, none of these techniques need be a mystery to you. You can actually see them being worked. Now, we've been talking again about stitch directions, and it starts to get just a little bit more complex. It starts to get to the point where you need to think three-dimensionally when we look at something like an open wing, because we need to look at those glorious feathers. And if we can go to the next one, please, of the owl, Trevor. We need to look at the direction of how each of those beautiful feathers is going to be worked. Now, the big flight feathers we're treating as individual entities. Whereas the type of opus plumarium, which I've been describing before, I call radial work, because it all comes down to a single point in the middle, a single core, where the radial stitches come together. This variation of the technique, still worked in just our simple stitch, is slightly different, and I call this directional work because we have an elongated cord going down the middle, which means that we have a directional stitch working its way down the length of each of those feathers. So now we're actually incorporating a directional stitch, which then flows into the rest of the body, which again flows up across the neck into the face and down to the core, which in this case, of course, is the owl's beak. And we also have that technique of adding strata into the stitching to get this marvelous pattern on the wing. And before you stop this particular slide, Trevor, there's one more little technique in here which you'll find crops up very often in natural history working, and that is when we have one particular colour, one particular shade surrounded by another type of shade. So if we look in particular, say down there on the rump of the owl, on his little white backside and on his legs. There are two very contrasting colours there. His markings, his feather markings, are dark, very dark brown, and the surrounding area is white. You can see that, as I say, just on his little backside. Oh, you're getting carried away now, Trevor. Yeah, so you can see that we have the dark colour surrounded by the white. Now, you might imagine that the way to stitch this would be to work all the white first, and then simply plonk the spot, as it were, on top. But if you do that, you're going to break the texture of the stitching, and ultimately it will in fact look as if you've got something stitched on top of your underlying work, which on something like the owl's body with this infinitely smooth, beautiful feathering that they have simply isn't the case. The colours of the feathers change, they mutate from one shade to another. So the way in which to do this is to think about the direction that the flow of the stitches is taking, work the spot first, and then flood the rest of the field around it. So by the time you get to working this type of subject, which is obviously a little bit more complex than the things we were looking at the beginning, you need to have a mindset whereby you're thinking to yourself, okay, I know the flow of the direction of the stitches, I can work those spots, and then you're able to flood the rest of it around it. And I was describing this technique many years ago in a live talk, and a lady piped up at the back of the room. She said, oh, I know exactly what you mean. She says, you do a whole load of black spots and then you work a white dog around them and you finish up with a Dalmatian. And ever since then, I've referred to this technique as Dalmatian dog technique, because it actually makes a lot of sense if you think of it that way. Thanks, Trevor. Okay, so we're now getting into the rather more exciting and slightly more complex subject matter. Although that side of things is not necessarily because the markings on the animal are getting more and more complex, because sometimes the challenge is in using a single shade, but concentrating on the direction of the work, the way you apply your one simple stitch to get the desired effect. And possibly the most challenging is to work either white on black, which is what we're going to look at now, please, Trevor, or indeed vice versa, black onto a pale background. But with something like our polar bear mummy and baby here, we're actually using the black background. And again, this is the same type of fabric as I mentioned earlier on. This is a black polycotton background, but we will chat a bit more about that during questions and answers if you're interested. But I've actually used that black background, allowing it to show just fractionally in places through the white stitching to emphasize the shadowy effect. Obviously, I'm able to use a grey silk to create the look of the shadowed area beneath his face, down onto his throat and onto her throat, I should say, and onto her chest. But I've also allowed in places just a little bit of that background fabric to show through, just to emphasize where the height of the shadow is. Now, you might also think that it would be, you might just as well leave the eyes simply showing the black fabric through, but it is surprising how different. Doesn't always look like it in a picture like this, but when you've got the original in front of you, how differently the stitched silk reacts to the background fabric. And although I've stitched, obviously, here a little white highlight into every eye just to really bring the eye to life, when you see it in the flesh, so to speak, the silk stitching the eye itself has got this wonderful sheen on it, just like the animal's actual pupil of the eye. And thank you for zooming in, Trevor. Stay there for just a moment, because the direction of the stitches here shows us just another little quirk of nature. Now, there are some animals, not many, but some, whose actual core, when it comes to stitching, is not actually the tip of their nose, but the bridge of the nose, what with a dog we would call the stop, a little bit higher up there. And you can see that the stitching here is all coming to a point to the core, almost between his eyes, up on the bridge of his nose. There's not all that many animals that have this. Horses are another one. And of course, those of you who have cats will know that the same thing is true of a cat. If you stroke your cat's nose from the bridge down towards his actual nose, his muzzle, I should say, if you're stroking his muzzle from the central point down towards his little pink nose or black nose, which I'm sure you've all done if you've got pet cats, you would never dream of stroking that part of the cat in the opposite direction, because that would be rubbing his fur in the wrong direction. Whereas above that stop mark, above that core, you sweep backwards. Thank you, Trevor. That's grand. So it's another case of knowing your subject, understanding nature, trying to really convey the nature of the beast, no pun intended, as opposed to using an elaborate stitch to create an effect which isn't necessarily any more successful. In fact, I would say in many cases less successful. And if we can have the next one, please, Trevor. We're sticking here with bears, although a very different one here. We've got another mummy and baby, this time obviously with the pandas. And here again, we have that change of direction on the stop, but basically the sweeping of the stitches from that core. Now, here we've got, thank you, Trevor, yet no nearer. We've got another little conundrum that crops up from time to time, especially if we're working on a black background, and that is when we have a bird or an animal basically with a black area of pelt or feathers, and we need to have that black area actually coming into contact, as it were, with the black of the fabric that we're working on. Now, immediately, because of the different texture of the silk or whatever you're stitching in to the background of the fabric, it is true to say that straight away you can see a slight difference. But a little trick which you can do is to just take a very, very fine thread, the finest thread that you do happen to have, and just pop a few little straight stitches at the very outside, in this case of baby panda's ear, just enough to give you the effect that that is lifted away from the background, that it does have, thank you, Trevor, oh, he's getting good, isn't he, that it does have a different effect. And then obviously we can do a negative effect of working things like whiskers here on Mummy with white against the black, and then working them in black against the white on her face. So all kinds of little tricks that we can bring into play. I've actually used beads here to create that floral effect as well. Thank you, Trevor. We're nearly there now. Our last two pictures basically go possibly, I don't know whether it's actually further afield, but it's certainly a little more complex. If we can go over to Gorgeous George the giraffe, don't get Trevor, don't get jealous, Gorgeous Trevor. This is again one of my favorite patterns, worked again with all the directional stitches given to you in the diagrams with our Vive Books pattern, and this is Gorgeous George the giraffe, and here's a perfect example of using that Dalmatian dog technique for the wonderful markings there on his cheek and down onto his neck. Now, one little wrinkle which I haven't actually mentioned before, when you're working on the pale background, we've talked quite a lot about little wrinkles when we're working on the black background, but when we're working on the pale background, another little technique which will give life to your subject matter, which will bring a reality to your embroidery, is to always include what I call the shadow line. Now, in order to get the positioning of your shadow line right, you need to think again about light. We've been thinking about light so far when it comes to light, the real light in the room around you, catching the direction of the stitches. But to get this little concept in your mind, you need to think about the imagined light source within the picture. So think that our giraffe here is out in the middle of the Serengeti somewhere. The sun is high, that hot African sun is beating down on him. And so the shadow line, I'm looking at his ears here to describe it. If you want to feel clever, Trevor, you can go into an ear. The shadow line is worked on the underside of his ear, on the lower edge of the ear, and that's it, up a bit. Brilliant. Yep, that's perfect. On the underside of his ear, beneath the white. But then if you look at the top edge of his ear, where it's folded over, you're seeing just a little bit of the back of his ear folding over to protect the tunnel, so to speak, that goes down inside his ear, where it's folded over. Your shadow line is on the underside of that folded bit, so that the top of that folded area, there's no shadow line. That is in the sunshine, that is standing out and shining at you because the sunshine is catching it. So it's a nice little wrinkle to get into your mind when you're thinking about directional stitching. Also think about what I call the imagined light source, the light within the picture. Wouldn't you just die for those eyelashes? Thank you, Trevor. We'll go straight into the next slide if you can do that, which is actually going to be our last one. People sometimes say to me, how can you bear to part with all these embroideries you do? And to be brutally frank about it, for 40 years, it's had to be my living. So that concentrates the mind wonderfully. You know, you do need to eat at the end of the day. And also you tend to run out of wall space. So I'm always happy to see my pictures going on to their new owners after an exhibition or what have you. But I do have to confess that my beautiful tiger, I've never been able to part with. He's never been for sale. I've had to keep him with me because I just love him so much. So this is the last picture we're going to look at, and I suppose in a way this, I don't know, I expect whether Vivian would agree with me, but I think this is the zenith of all the patterns that we've ever put together.
This is the showstopper.
This is the one, and I've seen people's work when they've recreated this, that they've actually worked it, and it looks stunning whenever it's done, and it looks strangely every time somebody does it. It's very slightly different. Tiger has a slightly different character. It's imbued with a little bit of a different look to him, but everyone is gorgeous, and he really is, I think, my favorite. So when we look at him, I think we can look at all the different elements that we've incorporated into our exploration, so to speak, of our simple straight stitch. Yes, we've looked at, or I've mentioned to you, that there are some other types of techniques that I do describe in the video and in the patterns, but the basic simple straight stitch is here in abundance. And if you compare this picture to the very first one that we looked at of the little white rose, you really can see that technique has run right through all the different subject matter that we have looked at. And Tiger here is looking straight at you and thanking you for your attention today, as indeed do I. I expect we've got a few questions still to come, but in the meantime, I will thank the lovely Trevor for all his hard work and hand back to Vivian so that she can decide what to do next. But thank you, everybody, very much indeed, and I hope you've enjoyed what we've done so far.
Well done, Helen. Thank you very much. I'm sure everybody did enjoy that. We've just got a few questions. If you still got some voice left. Yeah.
No problem at all.
I'll take them in order, and I'll try to unmute the relevant person that asked the question so you can have a conversation.
Lovely.
There's two more coming in. Right. Okay. We'll keep up. So Cindy, first of all. I'm asking Cindy to unmute. Don't know whether she can hear me.
Okay. Yeah. I'm unmuted, I think.
Hello, Cindy. Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi.
Cindy wanted to ask about the background. Go ahead, Cindy.
Yeah. It was with the poppy, but then you did address it with the bear in terms of using the black background to create more effect with the. So you did answer my question.
Yeah, you can kind of take the use the black background in particular. It doesn't work so well when you're on the pale background, but with the black background, especially for something like the poppies as well, because it's that very fine sort of papery effect of the poppy petals. I tend to work them in a very fine thread. So it's easier, if you like, to let a very fine line of the black background showing through. But again, art imitating nature, if you kind of hold a poppy petal up to the light, you can almost see the light coming through it. So, letting a little bit of that background through does help.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Cindy. Missy has asked about fabrics.
Types of fabrics.
Yes, she's saying
hi.
Hello, Missy.
Hi.
Hi, Missy. How are you?
I'm great. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Good. You're very welcome. Hello. Types of fabric. Well, as I mentioned, I personally have always enjoyed using a poly cotton. I'm guessing you're from the States. You're in the States, is that right?
Yeah.
From an accent? Yeah, I got there. I believe that poly cotton in the States, certainly more than here, you call it percale. Is that an expression?
Yes.
Yeah. In other words, it is poly and cotton mix, but generally it's about a 65 cotton, 35 poly. So you want a bit, if you can find that kind of mix. And it's not difficult to find. Basically, it's like sheet material. You know, it's
Okay.
like, it's what makes up a decent sheet, really.
Okay.
Unless you're one of these
Yeah.
people that have to sleep on pure Egyptian cotton, which I'm not.
Okay.
So it's not hard to find, you know. Now for the smaller pieces, a lightweight is ideal. If you're going to go into something really big, you can find it in a heavier weight too. But you can get it in a whole range of colours. I tend only to use the black, and I don't actually use white. It's very difficult with the photographs sometimes to see the colour that I work on. Photography doesn't always do it a great favour, but I tend to work on a creamy background rather than a stark white. I think a creamy background, or even a very pale grey, is better than working on an absolutely dead white one, which tends to be a little bit draining for the subject matter. But as I say, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't work on any colour you want to. And the polycotton, the percale, does come in a whole range of colours, and it's not expensive.
Right. Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have a question from Sheila. If Sheila can unmute herself. Sheila wanted to ask about using beeswax on your thread.
Oh, okay.
Hello, Helen.
Hello. I can't see you yet, but you're coming. I have no doubt. Hello. Hi. Yes, beeswax, or waxing the thread. Do I gather from that you use silk yourself? Do you do Japanese or Chinese embroidery?
I was lucky enough to go to China a few years ago, and I bought some Chinese silk when I was there, at a very reasonable cost, actually. And so I've had a go at trying to use it, and I find it gets quite static.
Yeah, I mean, I've never used it, the wax. It's a hard one. I think some people actually just store more electricity in their bodies. I'm not quite sure why it should get more staticky for some people than others. Are your fingers nice and soft, generally speaking? Do you go out in the garden doing your gardening without your gloves on?
Always wear gloves.
Ah, good girl. Good girl. I mean, embroidery and gardening do tend to be two things that many people like at the same time, but it is pretty disastrous if you do your gardening without your gloves on and then try and come in and do your embroidery, because especially with the floss silk, as you well know, it will catch on, any little irregularity on your fingers or your nails or what have you.
Been there, done that.
But yeah. Haven't we all? But on the whole, basically, all I can say is I don't use wax, but there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't if you find it works well for you. The silk that you got, was it fairly thick and you need to split it down to use it, or is it sort of in the single threads?
It is quite fine. It's a floss.
Yeah. Do you double and treble it up sometimes to use it?
So far, I haven't. I've just been practicing with it as it is.
Okay, well, what I do, I mean, the Piper's silk that I use is again a very fine floss. What I find is that if I use 3 of those strands together, they become about the same gauge as a single strand of stranded cotton, either Anchor or DMC. We're all familiar with that gauge, so I tend to refer to that and sort of call it my control gauge. And I find that if I'm working the substantial areas of a subject, such as our tiger's body or our bear, or even basically a leaf or a petal, not a poppy, which is particularly fine, but sort of a substantial subject matter, I find that I use what I call my control gauge, which is approximately the size of a single strand of Anchor, and that allows me then to come down to using 2 or 1 strand of a very fine silk for the details. So you might find if you put a couple of strands together that having each other to work next to might solve the problem for you. Have a bash at that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
We now have a question from Lizzie. Is Lizzie there? Lizzie wants to ask about your thoughts on rayon thread.
That's my thought too, but I wanted to know. Thank you.
Seriously, no. Let me start by saying, what are your thoughts on rayon thread?
I don't like using it.
No.
I know.
It's what I call, because it's not a natural thread, because basically it's man-made, it's what I call bouncy. It's almost impossible to get it to lie flat against your background fabric. Is that what you found?
Oh, yes. I was commissioned to do a tiger on the back of a jacket, and they wanted rayon thread, and I was like, no. And they were like, oh yeah, because they like sheen. And this was many years ago, and I did it, but I swore I'd never use it again. And when you were talking about using different threads, rayon popped in my head, and I was
right. Yeah. I mean, there was a time, almost really, when around about the time I first started professionally, it was actually quite difficult to get pure silk thread. I was very lucky because where I happened to live was close to an area in England where traditionally, centuries ago, silk was spun and basically spun. And so there's still, there was even then a remnant of that still available. And that was how I started using it. But since then, silk has become now, more readily available, and it's not quite the outlandishly expensive thing that it once was. But yeah, I agree 100% with you. Rayon is a very, very sort of sad imitation. But thank you for the question. It's an interesting one, something I hadn't thought about for a long time, actually. Yeah,
very much.
So we have a question now from Monica.
Hello.
Hello, Monica.
Hi, Monica.
Hello. Yes, I was just wondering what you board your finished project onto. Is it a sort of a cardboard, heavy cardboard, or is it a piece of wood?
No, I put it onto mount card, the same sort of card that they use for a window mount. A framer would use. I use the mount card. I do always make sure it's the acid-free version, because you can just sort of get the standard one. But if you get what they call, or here they often call it, museum quality, which means that it doesn't have any nasties in it, which over the years is going to affect either your background fabric or the silk itself. Just looking at what I've got here. In fact, that's the front of the little, can you see? Because I can't see what I'm doing. Put it on the, stretched on the back there, and what you can see there in between the threads is just the mount card. Yeah, thank you, whoever did that.
It makes it nice and light to hang up then.
Very, very light. Yes, it's lovely. And because I do tend to send a lot of things overseas, it does make life easy. I did, when I first started all those years ago, my daddy was alive then, bless him, and he in fact used to cut up hardboard for me, which of course
what I've used,
much heavier. Do you? Yeah. And I mean, it's perfectly good in those days, and I would advise that you do this as well. If you get some acid-free paper, pop that between, the back of your embroidery and the cardboard, just so that you've got that little bit of a break between anything that might happen to be in the card. I don't know what's in hardboard.
I use muslin underneath my embroidery.
That's a good idea.
So it's double thickness before it goes on the board. Yeah.
That's a good idea. Something just to as I say, in case there is anything chemically in the hardboard. But yeah, hardboard or basically, you know, whatever works, as long as it's rigid enough to take the lacing on the back. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Please feel free to type them into the chat.
While everybody's thinking, I will just answer a question that I know was sent in by somebody who couldn't at the last minute join us today, Debbie. She sent a question saying, what was the most difficult subject I'd ever had to do? And that was a bit of a poser. I thought about that one for a while. And then I suddenly, it came to me that overwhelmingly the most difficult subject that I had to do was not actually because the subject itself was difficult. I mean, goodness me, over the years, I've done everything from railway trains to centipedes. You know, it's amazing what people will ask for. But I've also, on many occasions, done pictures of people's houses and their gardens because they've wanted something like that. And I got this request to do a person's house. And usually if I get something like that, I'll go and visit them, take some photographs, come away and create a design. Anyway, I went over to this person's house. Those of you in England or who know England at all will know that there's an area not far from where I live in the east called the Fens, which is just totally flat. I mean, it's flat. It's like the Panhandle out in the States. It's flat. It's featureless. It is just, well, boring to tell the truth. And it has a certain grandeur, but, you know, there's just nothing there. And this person's house was the dullest little square bungalow you have ever seen in your whole life. There were no trees around it. There were no flowers in the garden. It was absolutely terrible. And they wanted a picture of this house. So it took me a long time and a lot of cross-examination of these dear people to work out what their hobbies were so that I could sort of try and bring something in, just liven this subject up a bit, you know. Anyway, we got there in the end and they were very pleased with it, but that was definitely the most complicated thing that I'd ever had to do, in that it did not lend itself, I have to say. So Debbie, that's the answer to your question.
Oh, thanks, Helen. If that seems to be the somebody's just said Julie, if I can find Julie, she's asking you what brand of silk and what weight of silk.
The best way to answer that, I will answer it now, so of course it is being recorded, so it will go into posterity, but there is a video on YouTube which I made talking all about the type of silk that I use, which has got the link through. It's actually called Piper's silk. It's produced here in quite near to me, actually. It's the silk I've used all the way through my career. In fact, I will show you what it looks like. Here we are. Now, just get the piece out. I use what they call 90 denier. Here we are. It's very fine. I don't know if I can get it to, if I put that up in front of the camera. Where's the camera? There it is. Can you see that, everyone? That's a single strand. If I put it in front of my thumb, you can see how fine that is. And this is the silk which, when it's trebled up, it's about the gauge of a single strand of anchor or DMC. So it's Piper's silk. If you go onto YouTube, onto my channel, which is called Helen M. Stevens, not very inspiring, but there you go. And one of the videos is Helen discusses Piper's silk or something to that effect. And that will tell you all about exactly what you need. But basically, it's 90 denier floss. If you then follow the links or pick up the web address for Piper's Silks, you'll see that they've got an absolutely beautiful selection of colours. I mean, here's just a few in my workbox that I've got here, just a few of the pinks, but I mean, they've literally got hundreds of different shades. I can't remember, Vivian, are we charted in the kits for Pipers, or did I chart generically?
I think you charted generically.
Yeah, but you know, as I say, you can very easily choose your colours from there. In fact, Pipers know my work so well, they'll very often just supply you with the colours you need if you tell them which kit it is you're working. Not always, depends, but you know, they know me obviously very well. But yeah, watch that video and it will tell you everything you ever needed to know, and a lot you didn't, about Piper's Silk.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie.